Welcome to History with Dr. Brovkin. Usually, my dear subscribers, you are used to listening to my playlist, Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. But today, it's somewhat different. Today, I continue with another playlist, which is called Personal Narratives. And in that playlist, which you can easily find, under that title, I have placed several of my reminiscences of my life, basically based on a long interview I had some 5 months ago with Karissa Tauber. It was very long and almost impossible to listen all at one go, and that is why I split it in several parts. So in the first part, it is called Born in the USSR. I describe my youth and my growing up in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg, called Leningrad at that time, and my university years and the shaping up of my worldview. The second part is called From a Russian Dissident to a Harvard professor, which essentially is devoted to the years when I came to the United States in the 1970s, and then my academic career that in the end brought me to Harvard as a professor of Soviet history. But there were many details along the way and the observations and so on. The third part is called Russia in the 1990s, where I went in the 1990s as a sabbatical year and have some impressions and reminiscences on that. In this part 4, I do continue with the Russia in the 1990s, but also I touch upon my scholarly battles. The scholarly battles meaning the issues that historians discussed about Soviet history, and specifically about the nature of Stalinism. And I discuss here my book, Russia After Lenin, and then my latest book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, and what I was against, what I was for, and why, and basically the scholarly atmosphere in the 1990s and early 2000s in American universities. I also then go to describe my years in Russia as an exchange professor, as a visiting professor in the early 2000s. And then again about the atmosphere of the time, touching briefly upon the origin of the war in Ukraine. So here it is. I invite you to listen to part 4 of my reminiscences, this life story of Dr. Brovkin.
I have tremendous respect for your intellectual independence, diversity of thought, and fascination with our human project writ large.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. And for those who don't know you, Dr. Brovkin, you were born in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg in the former Soviet Union. You attended St. Petersburg University before immigrating to the US at 23. You studied Soviet history and you did your graduate work at Princeton, Georgetown, and Berkeley. And then finally, you worked as an associate professor of Soviet history at Harvard for several years. You have taught in the US, in Russia, and in Morocco, and you're currently retired and living in France.
Correct. That's right.
And you've most recently published a very impressive book called From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity. I think your other books on Russian history include The Mensheviks After October, Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Dear Comrades, and Russia After Lenin.
Yes, correct.
Do I have them all? Okay, I will include links for that when we publish this interview, Dr. Brovkin. I hadn't heard of that last one, so I'll be sure to include that one as well.
Thank you.
So tell me, Dr. Brovkin, we have so much to talk about.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the story of your life. I know you were, and so then how long do you stay there for, Dr. Brovkin?
I stayed a year, which is like a normal sabbatical year, from the fall of 93 to the fall of 94. Yeah, then I came back to Harvard and again resumed teaching and I was finishing my next book, which was based on the archives. And this is the time for me to tell you very briefly about this book and why
Yeah.
Pike said it hasn't sunk in, and what's the big idea about it. And I'll be very brief. I'll take not more than a couple of minutes. Uh,
Oh, I'd
but
love to hear.
but the main contribution of this book is that I show the origins of the Great Terror and the origins of why Stalin did what he did. Now,
Mm,
most histories focus on Trotsky and power struggles, that he
mm,
had to get rid of him and this competition and that competition. And this is why he did what he did, which means, the attack on all the Bolsheviks and things. No, I have a totally different approach and totally different conclusion, which came from my study uh, uh, of society. And the
mm.
book is called Russia After Lenin, Politics, Culture, Society. So I study there not just politics, but cultural trends. There's a chapter on women, Soviet women. There's a chapter on young people, Komsomol. There's a chapter on peasants and how they behaved and what the expectations were on the workers and all kinds of segments of society, like a portrait of Soviet society in the 1920s. And what I discovered studying this in the archives is that things were going very well.
Mm.
So much so that in 2 years, from 25 to 27, Russian peasants produced more grain than they did before the war, before 1913. In other words, Russia completely recovered from the war and the revolution and began to provide surplus grain for world markets. Russian agriculture recovered thanks to private property, thanks to the NEP policy, new economic policy, which allowed peasants to produce for the market. In other words, market played miracles.
Mm.
And Russia was on the way to total recovery and prosperity. But, and this is the contribution. So far, nobody knows it, but it doesn't mean anything. The contribution is this. When I looked at the politics at each of the provinces that I was studying, what I saw was that the well-to-do peasants called kulaks,
Yes.
they were intermarrying with the party elite. The
Mm.
political elite and the economic elite were joining hands. They were
Interesting.
becoming one. And the trend was that the kulaks were going to absorb the Communist Party. In other words, if things were going that they were going, there wouldn't be any place for a Communist Party in Russia, or it would have to change its nature, as happened in China. It would have to be a party of business, a
Mm.
party that would recognize, principles of social justice, but allow private enterprise to work miracles. And this is what actually Bukharin called for, because Bukharin in 1925 said, peasants, enrich yourself. This was his words. Now, Stalin here had played along for a while, but then he went to Siberia and he saw some of the frustrated communists who had nothing to do, who were saying the party is disappearing. We have no place to play in this society that is going richer and richer all the time. Uh, and Stalin realized, and he called it in his speeches, Partina Kulatskaya Smычka, which means party kulak get together,
Mm.
merging. And he got scared. He understood, Comrade Stalin did, that if things were going the way they were going, the Communist Party would lose its control.
Mm.
And therefore what? Are you going to kill all the peasants? That's impossible. And he said, yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to kill as many as necessary. And he killed 10 million. Now,
Yeah.
at that time, people thought that's impossible. So, the contribution of my book is that I show that Russia had a very healthy society. The peasants who were not illiterate idiots, who clamored for having cooperatives and who had already the collectives, all this nonsense about Stalin creative collecting agriculture is BS. They already had cooperatives. They were demanding more rights,
Mm.
schools, roads. They were forming their peasant unions that were supposed to be legal because they were like trade unions. Stalin basically ordered in 1930, he sent specific orders how many should be killed in such a province, round up 250,000 in this province. In other words, it was a mass murder unprecedented in world history. Absolutely incredible. How could a government of a country kill,
Mm.
literally kill 10 million people, some by hunger, because the peasants resisted, and this was like another civil war. Then the peasants in desperation killed their animals, and as Steve Cohen said, they had one good meal. They would kill their cow and eat it, and that's it. And after that there would be nothing, and they would either die from starvation or deported to the northern camps. It was an immense tragedy, unbelievable tragedy. The 1920s, I mean 1930, 31, 32. But as it turned out, it was just the beginning of the tragedy, which later on led to the Great Terror. Again, in my book From Lenin to Putin, I have a chapter on Stalin's terror, explaining which categories of prisoners were arrested and why and for what purpose and all that. So also based on archives. But in any way, that is what shook up Pipes. And he said, this is a new vision and it would take some time to sink in, and it hasn't still sinking. People still think that Stalin was either crazy or just a dictator or just a communist, because all communists are the same. Well, not the same. And this is what happened. Yeah.
So why do you think even today in 2025, it still hasn't landed?
Because Western study of Russia and Russian history changed profoundly, profoundly. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sharp decline. For about 10, 15 years, nobody cared. All the faculties, professorships were shut down. Nobody cared. Nobody was interested. It only began to revive when Putin made Russia great again. And now they again giving money, and CIA is expanding its studies because they need to know what the Russians are up to. So the study of Soviet history is now reviving. But the older school, the people who are now seniors, like people in my age, they are the ones who, when I was young, they were the ones who were so-called revisionists, which
Mm.
means that they were the ones whitewashing Stalinism. And I wrote many articles fighting them. I was their enemy. I fought against them because they were saying Stalin is not that bad, and there were new opportunities, and there were new people coming in, and this is exaggerated, blah, blah, blah. And this was very fashionable at the time. And now they are the masters of the field.
Of course.
And what Steve Cohen wrote before he died was that many graduate students are afraid to take up topics that are not politically correct. So freedom, academic freedom, the way I knew it in the 1970s, is gone, at least as Russian studies are concerned. Now we have politically correct and politically incorrect. And therefore, it's the same sort of censorship as in the Soviet Union. America is slowly becoming like the Soviet Union, but that's a separate topic. At least as academic freedoms go, there's very little of it left.
Yeah.
And that's why it hasn't sunk in, because nobody really cares now as to why really Stalin purges happened. This is not a question at the top of the agenda. At the top of the agenda is how many missiles Putin has
Yeah.
and how strong he is going to make Russia.
So tell me, Dr. Brovkin, I admit my own ignorance on this. How does one whitewash Stalinism? What that generation of
Yeah,
scholars that you just described, what is the
yeah.
basis for their argument?
I'll tell you. So I don't want to name names because we fought enough.
Yeah.
But for example, there would be a book that would come out and would talk about how Russian workers were enthusiastic about building socialism, and how they were just fused with this energy, and this was an opportunity for workers to become engineers, and they would become this, and they believed in the bright future of the communists this and communists that. Okay, so I to this book like this, I would say yes, Yes, I think so too. But, and here the but. The but is that how do you know that they really felt this? How do you know that this is not official propaganda? Because official culture of the Soviet Union is that everybody had to celebrate and applaud the great leader. Because if you don't, at night the NKVD would come and pull you
Yes,
out and shoot you. Therefore, how can we believe that all this enthusiasm is not fake? Maybe there
exactly.
was one, maybe.
No.
But that doesn't mean that this is really opportunity. How can you celebrate the social mobility of a worker to become an engineer without knowing, or even if you know, that's even worse, that the engineer was a bourgeois specialist who was shot, and this is why his place becomes open.
Okay.
How can you say that this is a land of opportunity for simple people when a million people were arrested and shot in 1937 alone? See, I get agitated when I talk about it. And in those days, I actually criticized them in print, in scholarly journals. And
Mm.
some of them considered me a political enemy. And my suspicion, this is one of the reasons why I didn't get tenure at Harvard, because they were in majority. Those left liberal establishment, especially in Massachusetts, which was always liberal and always sympathetic to left causes, my kind of rough anti-communism, accusations of Stalinism, of mass murder, this was not in vogue. This was
Mm.
not in vogue. This was something that ran contrary to the political correctness of the time. So, it's interesting to mention, I always was against the current. At that time, I was too anti-communist. Today, they say I'm too pro-Russian. So I'm always against the current. That's my sort of political stance as it happened to be. Yeah.
And so what was it like being against the current about something you felt so strongly about during this
Well,
time, where
I,
there
I
was real consequence for this ideology?
Well, the consequences were that they didn't give me tenure. But you see, what some people didn't like, other people do like. In other words, there were always, this is why America was, maybe still is, a great country, because there were just as many people who supported me as that they didn't. And if these didn't, there were always journals and there were always other academics who wrote to me, yes, you're right, we support you. And they kept publishing. There were public debates for even in very, very prestigious journals. They published me and they continued to support me. So this was a time when there was genuine academic freedom, but they prevailed at least in my case, prevailed so much that even Pipes's support did not give me a tenure at Harvard. Looking back at it, actually, I was very upset and very hurt. But looking back at it, I actually think maybe it was for the better. I actually think it would have been a very monotonous life if, like some of my colleagues who stayed at the same university forever and ever, I had a very, very different experience, different countries, different cultures, and in retrospect, I think it was fine that it happened the way it did.
Yeah. It sounds like it all worked out.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
So, Dr. Brovkin, I scribbled briefly, and I want to go back to this. Um, how was the dissolution of the Soviet Union perceived in the US, and how did you, what was it like working in the US during that time, having a completely sort of different account of what was happening? And you detail this very extensively in your book. So, how did Americans misunderstand the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Yes, this is also very, very complex question because they're different Americans and there were different responses. As a matter of fact, in 2000, from 2000 to 2003, I was there were three of us, executive editor of a journal, Demokratizatsiya, the journal of post-Soviet democratization. Because I was an editor, I read a lot of articles and published a lot of articles. And that was the debate at that time. How should Americans perceive post-communist Russia? And there were two approaches. One was very friendly, especially it was in the time of 1990s. There was still, they wanted to help, they wanted new projects. The business community was investing money, investing in oil industry. There was a lot of enthusiasm and genuine support that Russia would become democratic and market and we could do things together. There was a lot of that kind. At the same time, there were a lot of people who felt, and I sensed that in the conferences that I went to at CIA and Pentagon, well, not Pentagon, it was CIA and FBI that I mostly went to conferences, and many think tanks, Heritage Foundation, Brookings, Atlantic Council. I was everywhere and
Wow.
invited everywhere. So there were a lot of people who felt the worse for Russia, the better it is to the United States.
Hmm.
If they dissolve, that would be just great.
Yes.
If they have difficulties, we should just applaud. If they want to take their money out, why should we care? Let them put their money in Russia, in American banks. In other words, these were the people who were advising Bush to expand NATO. And there were
Sure.
others who didn't. And among them, Pipes. This is also why we were still on very, very good terms, even 10 years after Harvard, because he said that it would be a big mistake.
Mm.
To include Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would generate a backlash. That would mean we would never have good relations with Russia. And we need Russia. We need Russia because China is rising and because there's got to be a balance of power. So these were people, George Kennan, also extremely prestigious, the founder of the Kennan Institute, where I
Yep.
started my career. He was saying the same thing. He was saying, no, there should not be any expansion of NATO. We should actually disarm as we are supposed to and disband all the blocs and start anew, a kind of a new relationship as was promised. Ambassador Matlock, who was later on Steve Cohen's associate in his committee for East-West Accord. But they were in a minority, they were beaten. And Bush is the guy who went to St. Petersburg in 2003, spoke at my university, St. Petersburg University, gave a lecture about democracy and how great Russia is, and at the same time came back and expanded NATO,
Yes.
calling Putin a friend at the same time, all at the same time. Yes, you're a friend, but we're going to expand NATO anyway. So
Yes.
that's the kind of a contradictory approach the United States did. In general terms, I would say that American business was favorably disposed to Russia.
Yes.
They opened up many factories and shops and McDonald's and Exxon and many big corporations went to Russia and established good working relationship. But the military-industrial complex decided that we should use this opportunity to weaken Russia and strengthen us. And these are the guys who are still in power and who still dictate policy.
Yeah. So tell me then, what that group of scholars that you allude to, how were their voices shut out from discourse? Was it they don't get tenure, they don't get invited to conferences, they get what does that actually look like? How did that censorship work in that era?
Well, you see, I was moving away from the Washington scene in the early 2000s because I accepted an invitation and I went to Russia. But what I could say, it was a slow process. There was a real fight in 2004 and 2006 when Pipes was very still significant influence, both politically, not only because he was a professor from Harvard, but because he was an advisor to President Bush on Russian affairs. So he was still very significant, and so did Steve Cohen. And there were many who had, a voice in American Washington establishment. But as I said, the business community listened to them, but the military community dictated policy. And especially since there's a growing, finish my sentence, there was a growing skepticism about Russia and fear of Russia beginning in 2003.
Mm.
And when I started my YouTube channel, one of my most popular videos that got 200,000 views in about a month was called "Why the U.S. Establishment Hates Russia."
Yes.
And in that video, I explained my thesis. The thesis is that in 2003, Putin and um, Chirac and Schröder,
Yeah.
the Chancellor of Germany, President of France, and President of Russia, both three of them, wanted to veto US invasion in Iraq if
Yes.
it were to be discussed at the Security Council. In other words, the nightmare of American establishment was if Russia and Europe joined
Yeah.
hands. This would be catastrophe. That would be the end of NATO, the end of American influence. And this is exactly what was happening, because people forget now, but Putin was a friend of Schröder.
Yes.
They were buddies.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Putin spoke at the Bundestag and spoke about the great joint responsibility for peace of Russia and Germany, of joint economic prosperity for all of Europe, from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And Chirac agreed. And so and Berlusconi was a best friend of Putin.
Yes.
So it appeared like Russia and Western Europe are getting close.
Yes.
So I can imagine a meeting in CIA or in the Pentagon say, how can we ruin it? Well, very, very easy. Well, we have to use the Baltic countries, who are now newly members of NATO, Poland, and Ukraine, to break it all up and to strengthen NATO. We need a little war in Ukraine. And at that time, everybody will come back and line up, and we will strengthen NATO, isolate Russia. If we're lucky, we could even break it up and finish the job that we didn't in 1991.
Yeah.
That's the plan. I'm quite sure of it. If there were archives to check, but there aren't any. I mean, maybe there are, but I would not be able to get access to those. But I'm sure that there were meetings like this behind closed doors. How can we break European-Russian Union, which is bulging, especially because it was Schröder and Putin who agreed to build Nord Stream 2. And they built already Nord Stream 1. And so it looked like a mutually beneficial relationship for Russia and Germany, and mutual interdependence. And the Americans hated it. They wanted to break it up, and they found a way to break it up.
So where were you, Dr. Brovkin, when this expansionist ideology really took hold in Washington? You had just left Russia?
I'll tell you how my life turned out at this point. So in 2001, after the 9/11, Bush was already in power, but he changed his tune very, very, very abruptly. And what happened was that I had a job offer from one of the think tanks in Washington, that they were very impressed with my work, and I was their frequent guest, and they wanted to send me to Moscow to work on a project there. And it was actually all ready to go. But then right after 9/11, I got a message that everything stopped. The priorities changed. And all kinds of projects that were in Russia were closed, finished, no more. And so this was canceled as well. But the point is that Bush was beginning with his war on Afghanistan, and then they prepared the war on Iraq, and this is when things began to unravel. But my situation was that once this job fell through, I went to an agency that has grants and opportunities for all over the world, and I asked them, "Do you have something for Russia?" Because I already was thinking of going there. And they said, "Yeah, we do. It's not much money, but you could teach in Russia as an American exchange program." And by that time, I was already very interested in Russia because my previous job with American University, I had a program in Russia and was going there all the time to Russia and to Ukraine. This was the program that we ran from American University in Washington, D.C. It was a program with Russian academics, and the purpose was to engage them in scholarly conversation. And another purpose was to bring them, to make them familiar with Western academic standards.
Mm.
So this was perceived as a spreading American influence, and this is why it was supported by all these USAID and others. And I like that because I did help them to survive and to actually learn what we say and what our standards are. So anyway, I was going often, every about 2 or 3 months. In
Wow.
2099 and 2000, every 2 or 3 months, I went to either Moscow or Kharkov or Kiev or Yekaterinburg in the Urals. And
Mm.
in one of those trips, I met Natalia, who is now my wife. We got acquainted and struck it off. And then when I asked for an opportunity to go to Russia, partly because I was thinking it would be nice to be in the same country,
Yeah.
they said, I said, what city? What city do you have? And they said Yekaterinburg. And I said, my God, how could it possibly be?
Wow.
Of all the cities that there are, it's such an incredible coincidence. And I said, that's the one I want to go to for any price. So they gave me this 1 year stipend. It was only $500 a month. My salary was 3,000 a month. So it was like a big cut.
Yeah.
But what wouldn't you do to be with a loved
Love
one?
is worth it. Yeah.
I'd go for free if I could. Yeah,
You would pay if you needed to.
yeah. So I
Uh,
went to teach in the Urals University,
yeah.
and the first year was this stipend, and then I wanted to stay because I really wanted to continue, and I talked to the rector, which is president of the university, and he said, "We'll love you. Of course, we'd love you to stay. We'll pay you as much." And so they made an invitation that I'll be a guest professor, and we stayed for 5 years. For 5 years, to 2005, we stayed we got married, we had a child, and we stayed 2001 and 3 and 4 and 5. In 2005, we came back to the States.
And what was it like teaching there compared to teaching in U.S. universities, Dr. Brovkin? What culturally, how was it different? In terms of freedom of expression, how was it different? Just
Yeah, I taught exactly the same way as it was in the United States. It was in English. So
okay.
this is one of the perks that was completely in English, everything, the curriculum. And the only thing that changed that when I was in America, I taught Soviet history and Soviet society, but there I taught American society.
Yeah.
So it was a course on American history and American society, and they were so interested. They really loved me, and I loved them. I always had good relations with students
Yeah.
because they always were very, very good at me. I always was popular in Harvard and elsewhere, but there I was their idol. They really loved me. They still write to me. Like,
Wow.
yeah, some of them still said, Never will forget your course of the lectures I took, and etc." So I taught in English, and they were very curious, very enthusiastic, and uh, the faculty also, they were very friendly. But I could see that I was an outsider for them.
Yeah.
I never got involved in their internal disputes and things.
Sure.
So I was really a guest professor. So I never really, but I'm still in touch with the president of our faculty dean. We had excellent relations, excellent. And they loved me and I loved them. And we had really good collegial relations. Now, it doesn't mean that they, between themselves, had everything smooth. I'm sure that there were some conflicts and there was a lot of discontent of low wages because the universities were still underpaid in the early, it began to improve in the early 2000s. But still, there was a lot of misery. They would teach different courses and work on the side and all kinds of things. But on the whole, it was a very happy time. Very happy.
And if you had to characterize how people, the level of optimism for future American-Russian relations at that time, what would you say? Were people hopeful or starting to get a little bit disillusioned and discouraged?
No, no, it was still full of hope. Because, for example, the dean of my department, he was doing Italian culture and Italian language, and he established some contacts with Italian universities, and he even had like the affiliate. Uh, the Italians were in the Urals University, and they had one in Italy where they
Oh,
would exchange students. And then they harmonized the degrees so that their degree would be equivalent to the Italian. There were excellent relations, maybe because of Berlusconi as Putin, but had really, really good, all kinds of programs. And with the European Union, they had all kinds of programs. And Russia adopted European standards in
mm,
degrees. What's a master degree? What's a bachelor's degree? So at that time, there was full course that Russia is Europe and there would be good relations integrating Europe into one cultural zone. This was still on in 2002 and 3 and 4 by the time I left in 2005. Yeah.
and you left and came back to,
We came back to the United States, to Florida, which is
oh,
where
okay.
my mother was and our house is. And one of the reasons was that we had a son and he needed some medical issues. And we thought if we stayed longer, that would be more difficult. So we decided to come back. But it was not so smooth and easy because I had difficulties with the Soviet visa, Russian visa. They were not sure that I'm not anti-Russian, as they began to suppose or suspect that many Americans were. So it was not that easy. My wife had to wait for a visa to come to the United States. But in the end, it all worked out. Within a few months, she did get a visa, and the American consul at Ekaterinburg was very, very helpful and understanding and really nice American, listening to you and trying to help. And I knew a lot of people like that. Americans are generally very, very friendly people,
Yes, they are.
and they try to be very human, very favorably disposed once you show them what your needs are. In any case, this was my impression, because he could have sent her off and he could have said, wait for 2 years. But he didn't. He said, well, yes, your husband just left. We will do our best to speed up your visa application. It was all legitimate. It was all no
Yeah.
tricks. It just was a matter of time, and he agreed to speed it up. And within 4 months, she came to Miami with our son, 6 months old. Yeah.
Was there a part of you that was sad to leave, Dr. Brovkin?
Well, it's a very difficult question because on the one hand, I really liked it in Russia. On the other hand, I was a foreigner for them. You
Yeah,
cannot always be. It's very difficult. Maybe you would understand it because only bicultural people could understand it.
yeah,
I was an American, in my way, the way I moved and the way I talk and the way I
yeah.
act. Even though I was a Russian, for them, I was an American.
That's
It was an interesting episode. One time, um, I came to a museum in the Kremlin, and I noticed that the tickets for Russians were five
yeah,
times cheaper than
yes.
for the Americans. So I came up and I spoke in Russian and I said, I need 2 tickets, please. And she said, are you a Russian? And I said, well, of course I am. Or are you? Don't you see, I'm speaking Russian like a Russian. She said, no, 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 no. I know
Oh,
you're not a Russian. I know you just speak Russian, but you're not a Russian. So
no.
could tell for some reason. And of course, I couldn't show her my Russian passport.
Yeah.
So somehow the way I act and move and talk was not Russian for them. I still
Interesting.
don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the Russians are a little more circumspect or not as open, and they are really afraid of the authority, and they're much more careful in what they say and to whom they say. I don't know. This would be a better question of my wife to answer. But so you can never live your whole life as a guest.
Yes.
There's always comes a time when you want to go to home, and for me, home was the United States because with all my critique of the U.S., I am an American. I feel like I'm an American.
Yeah.
Uh, I am a Russian American, but that's okay. There are Scottish Americans, there are
Yep.
French Americans, German
Yep.
Americans, whatever, Indian Americans.
Yeah.
And so I felt the time to go back.